So good morning, everybody. I am Andrew Cohen. I'm director of the Jean Beer Blumenfeld Center for Ethics, and I also teach in the philosophy department at Georgia State University. We are delighted this morning to have another installment of the Jean Beer Blumenfeld Center for Ethics Spring 2021 Speaker Series, Ethical Dialogues Across the Virtual University, Multidisciplinary Perspectives. Before I introduce our special guest discussant today, Dr. Brandon Warmke from Bowling Green State University, we must first have, as I often do, a weather report. And I am sharing the screen right now that shows a scene from the Toledo Zoo, and that is where today's weather comes from, Toledo, Ohio, which is a short drive from where Dr. Warmke works. Toledo, as many of you know, is a large city in Northwest Ohio known as a major Great Lakes trade center and home, among other things, to significant glass manufacturing. Toledo is also home to a splendid art museum whose entrepreneurial directors grab major exhibitions as they tour the United States. I once saw a fantastic Renoir exhibition there. And what you're looking at here is where Toledo is also home to the first, and I believe world's largest hippoquarium, which is pictured here from the Toledo Zoo. You wouldn't know it looking at their lumbering gray mass on land, but hippos are impressively agile in water. And though they're vegetarian, don't anger a hippo. Right now in Toledo, it's a bit cloudy and rainy in the mid-60s. And today's weather in Toledo is cloudy with scattered thunderstorms. And tonight, continued storms. Tomorrow, more of the same, but you can expect clearing on Sunday in the mid-70s. Let me turn off this thrilling share. All right, now to our guest, Professor Brandon Warmke. Brandon Warmke teaches philosophy at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio. Warmke has been at BGSU only a few years, but has already accumulated 24 publications and a few books. His work has focused on ethics, social and political philosophy, and on themes in moral psychology. Among Warmke's many prestigious publications are several pieces on forgiveness, as well as some articles on punishment and moral responsibility. Warmke's work has been profiled in popular and lay media. He has presented his research at superb venues throughout North America, Europe, and Australia. Among his publications are also a collection he co-edited with Nelkin and McKenna on forgiveness, as well as a forthcoming book with Justin Tosi on minding your own business. And the topic of our discussion today, a book he co-wrote with Justin Tosi from Oxford University Press on grandstanding. And we are delighted to have with us Professor Brandon Warmke, who joins our seminar today to discuss some themes from his book. So before we turn this over to Dr. Warmke, Connor, you had said that Katie is waiting, but I don't see her among the attendees. So I just want to make sure I'm not locking anybody out.
I see her on my screen. Yeah.
You do?
I did that. Sorry.
Yeah, she's here now.
Oh, thank you. And nice to see. I appreciate it. Okay, perfect. Okay. So I'll be quiet for a moment. So Dr. Warmke, you can tell us a little bit about the book, and then we'll just launch into a seminar discussion on themes as we might see fit.
Thank you for that very generous introduction. Toledo is a wonderful city. I don't want to live there, but they have some nice things to visit, and that's very generous. Thank you for having me. It's pleasure to join you all today. Thanks for reading the book too. I think Justin and I appreciate that, and taking a few weeks to do that is always rewarding to hear about. So why did we write this book? Justin and I went to grad school together at the University of Arizona, and in a parking lot one day after eating some burritos, which is what you do in Tucson, you just eat tacos all day, every day. That's all. That's how we got through grad school. It looked like a lot of people started using social media differently. This is around 2014. It seemed to us that people were using social media when they discussed moral and political issues to make themselves look good. It looked to us like a lot of the things people were saying resembled corporate press releases. We support this. I believe this. We would never do this. I object to this. And so we got to thinking about the topic, and at the time, there was only really one word for this sort of behavior, which was grandstanding. Virtue signaling hadn't come about yet, believe it or not, in common discourse. And so we ended up writing a paper that came out in 2016, and then it morphed into this book. As you know, from having looked at the book, we think moral discourse is a tool. It's a very valuable tool. And like any tool, it can be used well towards good ends, and it can be used poorly towards bad ends. And there are lots of ways to abuse public discourse. Grandstanding isn't the only one, but we do think that when people use public discourse, moral talk to seek status, to show off how good they are, they're always doing something bad, and often they're doing something morally wrong. And so the goal of the book is to try to motivate the view that we should be less inclined to use public discourse to further our own social status or to make ourselves look good, and to try to sublimate those desires to other more important ends of public discourse. So I'm happy to talk about anything in the book, anything in the original paper. There's some things that are actually in the paper that didn't make it into the book. And then we've also done some empirical work with the psychologist Josh Grubbs since the book came out. So we've published 2 psych papers, and then we have 2 under review right now. So we've done about 7 studies with 6,000 participants, and some of those are ongoing now. So we have some multi-year longitudinal studies on grandstanding. Happy to talk about, if I can remember what we've done, I'm happy to talk about any of that stuff as well.
Jake, do you mind if I put you on the spot? So Brandon, I have mentioned this to you in email as well. One of the themes that that came up from our conversation last week and continued into this week was what some students called a detectability problem. And there was this issue of trying to sort out how we can be in a position to detect the grandstanding desire, and how the lack of access that we have to people's intentional states may actually impact the content and the scope of the concept of grandstanding. And Jake, you said it better than I just did. I wonder if you could elaborate on what you had in mind on that.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's basically it. I mean, I guess I would also, I'll just go ahead and jump in, I guess, with the question. It's like, what would you say are the justification conditions for asserting that somebody else is grandstanding, given that the definition of it is so contingent on this sort of judgment of intention that's with the, you talk about the recognition desire, and then you talk about the grandstanding expression, which actually refers back to the recognition desire. So it entails the recognition desire, even just on that part of your definition. And that's the 2-part formula, right? For an act of grandstanding. So I guess I'm wanting to know, it seems like there should be a fairly high burden of proof if someone wants to say this person is grandstanding. I'm a lot more sympathetic to the idea that I should try to make sure I'm not grandstanding, but I'm thinking, what is the burden of proof, you think, in order to say somebody else is grandstanding?
Yeah. Thanks, Jake. That's a really nice question. You're not going to like my answer. Well, I don't know. Maybe you might. I have a few answers. We'll see which ones, if any, you like. Here's an answer. We'll see if you like it. If you don't like that, I have others. It's whatever. Okay, it's similar justification conditions for accusing someone of lying or bragging. So, lying is just not saying something false. It's saying something with, now this is contested, but it's saying something with some sort of mental state, an intention, desire to deceive. There's this whole literature on what lying is. But the key part is that, you say something, and I'm not sure if you're lying or not, even if you're saying something false. I mean, if I told you right now that I was born in Jasper, Indiana, and I say, am I lying or not? Look at me in the eye, Jake. You know, it's going to be really hard to tell. And so I don't think this is a unique problem for grandstanding. I don't think it really poses any particularly difficult problem for any phenomenon that we think has an essentially hidden component from third-party view, maybe even from first-person view. Sometimes it's even, as we point out in the book, it's hard to know whether we're grandstanding ourselves. And so I guess I don't know exactly what the not that you're raising a criticism, but what the criticism would be regarding either the account or the concept of grandstanding. Because I think grandstanding in this respect is no different than lying or bragging. And this is why you don't go around calling people liars when they say things that are false, right? You think, well, maybe they're not lying. Maybe they're just saying something that's not true. You know, if I say something nice about myself, you know, you don't immediately accuse me of bragging. You might think, well, maybe he's just not reading the room, or, you know, maybe he's just trying to convey information. He's not really trying to show off. Okay, so that's my first answer, is that it's a kind of companions in, I'm not even sure it's guilt. It's like companions in, like, this is just part of life. You can't read others' minds, but there are useful concepts that we have that invoke others' mental states. Demagoguery, bullshit. I mean, think about Frankfurt's view of bullshit. Frankfurt's view of bullshit has an internal component, right? It's your indifference to the truth or something like that. So, you know, I think grandstanding is of a piece with all these other phenomenon. Now, if you're asking me what exactly are the justification conditions, I don't know. But I do think they're pretty high. I mean, I think what we argue in the last chapter, if I recall, is that you probably shouldn't go around calling people grandstanders for this very reason. Is that the epistemic bar is very high and the moral costs are very high of making the accusation. Okay, we'll see. Is that how do you like those answers?
I mean, I like some of it. So, I mean, I guess the only thing that I would add, that I would say, is that with something like lying, I agree that, yeah, obviously there's a judgment of intention there too. It's not just saying a falsehood, right? But at least there's a starting point for making an accusation of lying, which is, I do know you've said something false. So from there, I can sort of work backwards and try to determine what your intentions are. Whereas with this, with the way you guys have defined grandstanding, so you've got the recognition desire, and that's a judgment of intention. Then you've got the grandstanding expression, which is that judgment of intention plus an act of moral talk. So the only starting point is an act of moral talk that I have there. It doesn't. Yeah.
I'll just say two brief things. One is, as far as I understand the literature on lying, I actually do think it's contentious whether you have to say something false in order to lie. No, I think most lies involve uttering a falsehood. I'm not sure that's true of all lies. I'm not an expert in the lying literature, but it may not be as clear cut as just having the starting point of a falsehood and then maybe adding more evidence to that. In the case of grandstanding, it's not really. I mean, I don't think, and I think we say this in the original paper, I don't know if this made it into the book as clearly as we might have wanted, but it's hard to see how just anything could be a grandstanding statement. Like, these pretzels are making me thirsty. Something's missing there. Or even if I say these pretzels, you know, were made by, you know, were produced by a morally admirable free trade organization or whatever. It's like, that's a moral statement. It's a grandstanding. Well, I mean, I think you're right that lots of things can be grandstanding statements. That's true. But they are delimited, at least in this respect. It has to be about morality in some sense. And I think grandstanding statements tend to invoke or have implicit content regarding the speaker. So there has to be some indirect sort of, or implicit assumption that the speaker is communicating something about herself or himself. Now, that doesn't get you that obviously doesn't get you, like, you can look at a grandstanding statement and say, oh, it's grandstanding. But again, that's true with a lot, bullshit. Think about bullshit. Anything could be bullshit. But no one seems to worry about that. So I wonder if there's an important difference there.
We have one seminar participant who was dialing in from a foreign country, and then Zoom locked him out, but I've got him on my phone. This is David Simpson. And if I can do this correctly, David's got a question. So David, I'm gonna put you up close to my mic, so go for it.
Am I audible to all?
All right, wait, let me make you a little louder. All right, try now.
Am I audible? Can I be heard?
I'm seeing lots of thumbs up, so go for it.
Okay, so first of all, Dr. Warmke, I love the book, and one thing that I do like about it is that it includes lots of psych literature. I'm someone who sort of lives at the intersection between psychology and philosophy. One thing that you cite, one set of data that you cite, is evidence showing that people can be unaware of their own motivations. And one thing that I didn't like or didn't agree with is that you add the condition that it's possible for someone to be grandstanding or to satisfy the recognition desire criterion without being aware of it. In other words, they can have moral status as an unconscious motivation. And this worries me because it seems to violate the ought implies can dictum. It seems that by definition, if something's unconscious, it's not something that's within your control. And so moralizing about people's unconscious motivation seems problematic on those grounds. So I wonder what you'd say about that.
Thanks. That's a great question. I'm glad you liked the book. Long-time listener, first-time caller. That's what that sounded like. Anyway, so let's see. Well, so one question, I'm not going to ask you this because this is unfair. I'm not going to put you on the spot. What do you mean by ought implies can? That's one question. Another question is, well, let's think about this. I think, suppose I'm at a dinner and I realize, so I'm talking a lot about myself, and in the moment, I think what I'm doing is just giving people helpful information about my income or my, I don't know, social status or something. And then I realized, laying in bed that night, I was like, man, that was really gauche. That was really, it was really braggy. And I come to realize that basically what I was doing was I was bragging. In the moment, I wasn't aware that that's what I was doing. In the moment, I wasn't, consciously aware of these motivations. It just seemed to be the thing to do, or I felt social pressure to impress people, and so it just kind of blurted out. I don't know if the fact that I wasn't at the time aware of these, whatever the motivations are of bragging, that I was consciously aware of those motivations. I don't know if first it prevents me from bragging at all. I think conceptually we would want to say, well, it could still be a kind of bragging. I think it still is bragging. And second, it doesn't seem to prevent bragging in that case from being morally bad and morally criticizable. There's this whole literature on blameworthiness and under what conditions someone is blameworthy, and under what conditions when someone's acting on motivations that they're not fully aware of when they're blameworthy. It might be the case that there is a sense in which I ought not to have bragged, and there is a sense in which I ought not to, or I was not aware of what I was doing. It seems to me, though, that that's a very strong version of the ought implies can principle, that you cannot be morally blameworthy, let's say, or do something morally bad or wrong, simply because you were unaware of the motivations that you were acting on. I don't think the fact that I'm unaware of the kind of motivations I'm acting on prevents me from controlling my behavior.
David,
No,
just Go ahead.
I have some thoughts, but
Yeah,
that is helpful.
I'm happy to have a follow-up if you have more to say.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm wondering, and first of all, and this might be just a point of clarification, do you think there are, and I feel like your book would imply this, do you think there are cases of grandstanding that are made wrong simply on the basis of the recognition desire? In other words, there are some acts, I think this would be the implication, that there are acts that, were it but for the motivation they had, they would have been morally permissible. And if so, that makes me wonder about the example you gave of bragging, because I'm inclined to think that even if someone didn't have the motivation to make themselves look good, it's just sort of socially inappropriate to be talking about yourself in that way, even if your motives were totally pure, even unconsciously. Whereas, arguably, there are cases where people say the same sorts of things that a grandstander says, but they're not morally problematic because they lack any motivation to achieve recognition, conscious or unconscious.
Good. Yeah, that's a fine question. I do think you're right that we think that there are moral considerations that tell against grandstanding simply in virtue of acting on the recognition desire. I think that comes out in chapter 5 and 6. So the virtue chapter and the respect chapter. I think you don't need, I'm not sure you need much more than acting on those desires in public discourse to get at least some moral badness. Yeah. So I take your point that it may be the case that unwitting grandstanding is less morally bad than witting grandstanding, and I think I'm okay with that consequence.
There are 3 persons with hands up, and one of the themes that I hope we can, well, there are several themes I hope we can get to. One of them concerns the possibility that there might be some non-bad grandstanding, which the authors seem to leave open the possibility for. And another one, which I hope we get to, is the really cool analogy between grandstanding and the as a commons tragedy. But the hands that I saw pop up were Ben, Anastasia, and Tom. So Ben, take it away.
Hi, Dr. Warmke. Thank you so much for coming to talk with us. So kind of in a similar line as David, so you were saying that like the desire is enough or is sufficient for something to have this element of moral badness. And I think that's probably plausible. Like if you have a desire that's uncouth, then it makes your action less good than it might otherwise be. That seems perfectly fine. The problem that I see is that, and this is kind of in the same vein as Jake's undetectability problem, is that a lot of times when we even use the concept of moral grandstanding, it is in a third-person account. Like it is in an accusatory context, and it seems to me that if you don't have these well-defined sufficiency and necessity criteria as to what constitutes moral grandstanding in a contextual sense, not necessarily in like a psychological sense, then you leave totally open what most people think of when they think of grandstanding. It's like it's very valuable to protect yourself against the whole grandstanding thing, but it seems that when the concept is invoked at all, it's usually in like, oh, that guy's just grandstanding, or oh well, this guy was grandstanding on social media, or this guy was like, it seems to almost always be in a third person context. So I feel like the account has a weakness in that it leaves really vague the sort of third person contextual criteria, necessity and sufficiency, for most of what we talk about with the concept.
Yeah, good. I'm going to ask you a follow-up. Can you say a little bit more about what you mean by, so is the thought that there's what you would want is a sort of a set of necessary and sufficient conditions for a third person being able to identify it?
Yeah, precisely. Yeah.
What if I gave you those? So So here's one. If all you want is a set of necessary and sufficient conditions, here's one. God tells you it's grandstanding. Now, presumably that's not the kind of thing you have in mind, right? You want something like, well, I can observe grandstanders and like be certain or really justified in forming the conclusion that they're grandstanding. Is that's what you want, right? Yeah.
My worry is that it seems like on your account, any use in a third person sense of the word grandstanding itself becomes grandstanding, because you can't, the epistemic justification is like never satisfied, because you can't get into somebody else's mind. And so like in the context of the sort of problems that Jake was talking about, if you go and accuse someone of grandstanding, well, now you're grandstanding, like by every sense of how you've defined it. And you literally can't get away from that. It seems to me that's a worry.
Okay.
Am I mistaken there?
I think so. Here's why. So two things. One is, if you're right, then it looks like no one is ever justified in either judging privately or accusing publicly anyone of lying, of bullshitting, of bragging, of demagoguery. And that might be your view. It's just that the epistemic bar is never reached to either judge privately or publicly. You might think the bar for public accusations higher, so that you might think in order to blame someone publicly, you need better reasons to believe they're doing this particular thing. But if you think it's just sort of like in principle, as a matter of empirical fact, because we're not mind readers in this really demanding way, that no one's ever justified in accusing someone of lying, that seems to be a consequence of that assumption. That may be your view, and that might be fine. The other thing that I would say is I don't think it's true that whenever you publicly judge someone to be a grandstander that you're grandstanding, because you might call someone a grandstander for lots of reasons that have nothing to do with wanting to be seen as morally impressive or wanting to raise your social status. Maybe you sincerely believe this person is grandstanding and you want other people to know it. That's it. I don't think that qualifies as grandstanding. I mean, not on our account anyway. That doesn't qualify as grandstanding. You're like the Kantian like moral accountant, right? And you want this person has done wrong, and you want other people to register it in their moral ledgers that this person has done wrong, done wrong in this particular way. I don't think that entails, as a matter of sort of our account, that person's grandstanding. So so I'd push back and say the first, your first objection has some teeth. What I would say is it might have too many teeth. You might catch all these other things in its net too, and then we're not allowed to call people liars, ever. But it's probably true that you're justified more often in accusing people of lying than grandstanding. That's probably true.
Oh yeah. So your second point is like, your second rebuttal is totally fair enough. I was a bit overstepped bounds in saying that one, like, calling people out is gonna basically always be grandstanding, especially on your account. For the former though, I would say that, as David said, there are lots of like robust contextual or social indicators of like bragging that don't necessarily come back to psychological factors. And I would say the same probably could be said for lying. But it seems like bragging, again, you can make an account of bragging that's purely contextual or social. It doesn't necessarily come back to psychological, or you might even be able to make an account for that of lying, but it doesn't seem like you have anything like that on your account.
That's true. So, if someone just wanted to give a totally functional account of grandstanding, and some people have suggested this, they don't like the mental stuff. A lot of people don't like the mental stuff. Personally, I don't know how you give an account of grandstanding or lying without mental stuff. But if you wanted to have an account of lying or bullshitting or bragging that was totally functional, like the function that it played in some language game or some context of discourse, what effect it had on people, how it functioned in the discourse, without making essential reference to mental sort of content, bring it on. You know, I'd love to see that kind of account of grandstanding. I don't know if it's going to be better than ours, but I'd love to see it.
Well, thanks for that, Ben. And that actually touches on a bunch of themes that Brandon and Justin talk about in the book, with this sort of recursive concern that the very writing of the book is somehow a form of hypocrisy. And that also comes up in some of the later chapters where, as good philosophers, they're also saying, well, we have to give an account, and the very giving of the account doesn't necessarily, we're not necessarily disempowered to give an account, even though some people might potentially accuse us of engaging in the very thing that we're criticizing and giving the account. But that interchange that Ben was just having with Dr. Warmke seemed very fruitful, because a zillion hands went up, and I saw them in this order. It was Anastasia, Tom, Sherry, Connor, Karung, and then Lynn. So Anastasia, go for it.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Warmke. Frankly, I don't see how you can give an account of anything social without referring to all the mental stuff. And my question / concern / discussion point is more concerned with this, suggestion that we shouldn't be accusing people of grandstanding, but there is something that we can do, and that is recognize when we grandstand themselves and try to minimize that. And it seems that the kind of account that you're offering has the tools to allow one to recognize when they might be grandstanding. And in particular, I think we can distinguish between two types of tools, one more forward-looking and one more backward-looking as a strategies for recognizing. So with forward-looking one, I'm thinking more about, attending to one's intentions. And you distinguish between, you acknowledge that people can have all these different motivations present in any single act. And the recognition desire might as well be one of them, and not necessarily recognition desire contaminates whatever act is right away, but it depends on the strength of the recognition desire, the way I'm reading it. But then there is also a backward-looking, more backward-oriented way of understanding your act as grandstanding, that is attending to the feelings of disappointment that you experienced upon not receiving the desired recognition. That I take to be partly addressing that issue of how we act quickly. We don't always reflect on what motivates us to commit any single act, but we can reflect on our act, on the way people responded, and on our feelings. But it seems that part of the worry with understanding somebody else's grandstanding is that we're interpreting them, and our interpretation is can be easily misguided. Because, as it has been pointed out, we don't have access to their inner mental life, but also because we have all that context, I think, that guides our interpretation of the other's act. And there has been some work in psych that also shows that people can interpret their general arousal very differently depending on what context they are put in. And I'm thinking that it is possible that we are self-interpreting machines of some sort as well, that we are interpreting our emotional responses in part due to the context in which we are placed. And so when I'm imagining a situation that I posted something on Facebook and really criticized the hell out of somebody's, moral behavior or immoral behavior, what I see to be, and then nobody responds. And here I can be disappointed because nobody responded to my amazing showcase of my moral character, but also maybe because I really care about this issue, and I'm disappointed that people do not show the same kind of recognition and care for that issue. And it seems to me that those are, again, two different kinds of disappointment, or disappointments reacting to different subjects, which may be contingent on the kinds of motivations that I had in the first place. But it also seems to be very sensitive to the kind of context. So maybe right before I started to reflect on that, I was reminded of my social status and my desires to be kind of recognized member of the society. Or maybe right before that, I came from the seminar that was talking about all the importance of that issue that I posted about. And so this feeling of disappointment that I have when I look at the absence of likes can be interpreted differently by me myself. And that's the point where I'm a little bit hesitant to say that people are able to recognize those either motivations or their disappointment afterwards, in part because we're so dependent on our self-interpretations, on the contextual cues. So yeah, do you see the worry? I feel like it is likely that the ability of people to recognize grandstanding, if that is the desired outcome of somebody reading the book, being familiar with the concept, is itself not as likely as we can hope for.
Yeah, maybe not. Maybe the best we can do is a little bit of improvement. I don't think the book is going to help. I guess it's kind of a self-help book. I don't think the book is not like a grandstanding odometer, grandstanding meter, where it gives you the tools to all of a sudden grandstanding pops up on your radar. So I think the best we can hope for with the book is that it gives people some tools to perhaps eliminate some grandstanding. And I think if that's all we can do, I'm happy with that. If the bar is that, we need some test to be able to eliminate all of our moral mistakes, I think that's probably too high. I will say about the disappointment test. I mean, it's true that we think that one way. I don't think we say this in the book. We use the disappointment test for something else, but I think it's true that one way to sort of in retrospect, introspect about whether you were grandstanding is to ask if you were disappointed. But it's not just disappointment as such. It's not just any old disappointment. It's disappointment that people didn't come to see you the way that you had hoped that you wanted them to see. So it's like, I write this long post about how, no one should ever burn the flag. And if you burn the flag, you should go to hell. And true Americans stand up and, stand with me, and then one from my uncle or something. It's that's a little disappointing. And that might be evidence that what I was doing was I'm not disappointed that no one's up in arms about flag burning. It's that I'm disappointed. I mean, that could be too, but I'm also disappointed in that no one saw me as a true patriot. And that might be some evidence that I was using moral talk for self-promotion instead of some other more valuable purpose. But I agree. I mean, I think as you point out, these are often empirical questions, and the interventions, the psychological interventions into grandstanding, that's an empirical question too. So there's an entire research project here about what kinds of interventions might work to not only prevent others from grandstanding, but prevent ourselves from grandstanding. And what we do in the book is sort of start the conversation, hope to start the conversation.
Just a quick follow-up. Do you think there is a worry that people who will be most likely to successfully recognize the acts of grandstanding are those kinds of people who actually have the least of that motivation for recognition desire? I'm thinking of somebody with narcissistic personality disorder, or somebody who is really good at creating the picture of themselves to themselves, of their great moral character. They might not even reach the point of feeling disappointed because they already constructed the reality in their head in which they have the explanations for why people didn't respond to their post. I worry that those people who solely respond, do this kind of stuff for the sake of the grandstanding motivations, they might actually be less introspective. That's
probably right. In our empirical work, I think we briefly mentioned this in the book, but grandstanding highly correlates, prestige strivings highly correlate with narcissistic extroversion and dominance grandstanding highly correlates with narcissistic antagonism. So, I mean, if someone's like really high on narcissistic antagonism or extroversion, they're probably not going to be convinced by this book, right? It's like writing a book about how like lying is wrong and then hoping that you convince pathological liars that lying is wrong. It's like, that's probably not your target audience. So I agree, you know, we're not catching, you know, but if you look at the normal distribution, like we're not catching like the people who score really high. The idea is to try to talk to the people in the middle who are not narcissists, not as narcissistic as some others, and help them see that feeding these desires for attention is not helpful to public discourse. That there's still hope. There's still hope for people who, you know, do have a choice about what motivations they act on in public discourse, and they can sort of control themselves. I think you're right that for people who score high on narcissistic scales are probably not going to read the book. Well, they're not going to read the book in the first place, but they're probably not going to read the book and think, oh, I've been doing this all wrong. That's right.
Thank you.
Tom, you're up next.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Warmke. I really enjoyed the book, and I also think the arguments are very persuasive. And I brought
Thanks for your question. Next. No, I'm kidding.
So right before this, in our seminar, we had read Linda Radzik's Social Punishment book.
Uh-huh.
And some of the kind of things we've been talking about in the past few weeks about social punishment involve questions of cases where maybe the punishment is disproportionate or the person didn't fully deserve the sort of, you know, online pylon or whatever, but it's still useful in consequence in getting people to not do those things. And so while I personally find the later chapters in your book about virtue and respect and things like that very persuasive, is there a case that we could make to a sort of hardcore consequentialist who just says at the end of the day, even if, you know, people doing this is disvirtuous for them, it stamps out bad actions that we don't want? Is there a convincing response to those people?
I hope. Good. So the way that we wrote the book was, it's sort of like a buffet of morality. Like, well, hey, what do you care about morally? Well, we have something for you. So let's just think about the consequentialist. So let's not think about chapters 5 and 6. Not even the virtue consequentialist. Let's just set those aside and just ask, you know, as a social practice, I take it you're asking sort of like pylons, whether they're motivated by grandstanding or not. Is that the idea? Social pylons, whether the yeah. Can they be useful? Sure. Are you on Twitter, Tom?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. I don't know how many of those are useful. I mean, well, they're useful for some things. I don't know how beneficial they often are. And I think there's two things to keep in mind here. One is, look at any given pylon. How likely is it that this person did something bad or wrong? And then second, how often does the response to these behaviors, whether they're good or bad, how often does the responses to these behaviors actually promote good norms? So it might be the case that in some particular instance, right, someone is disincentivized from doing a bad thing in the future. But we got to play this game over and over again, right? It's iterated. So you have to ask, you create norms. And at some point, you're going to create norms where people are going to be afraid to speak, and they're going to be afraid to speak not just in bad ways, but in good ways, because they don't want to be the target of an internet pylon when they've done nothing wrong. So I'm a bit of a million in this respect. I think that free speech does involve freedom from certain kinds of social punishments. And I think there is a great danger in letting the mob tyrannicize free discourse. And I don't buy the line that this is just accountability. I just do not buy that for a second. I think that's what people tell themselves, but I just don't think that's what's going on. I mean, I'm sure it happens in some cases where people really think they're like, you know, meting out appropriate justice or something, but I don't think that's really what's going on. So this is a big empirical question. If you're just looking at the consequences, you have to look at not just the consequences of this particular instance, like, does this particular thing disincentivize people from saying this kind of thing? It's what kinds of social norms are being created. And it's hard to look at Twitter, for example, and think, oh yeah, these are good norms. And so each act of social pylon contributes to the creation of certain kinds of norms, certain kinds of expectations about what's going to happen when I speak out. And I think in general, people should be free to speak their mind without fear of, you know, being called really horrible names on Twitter by thousands of strangers. So I don't know if that really answers your question. It's a fine question. It's an empirical question, and I think one aspect of this question that people often don't have in mind is the norms that are being created.
Yeah, I think you did touch on a lot of what I was concerned about. I do still worry, though, that the folks on Twitter most inclined to support this sort of behavior kind of think like, oh, so, you know, so what if conservatives or libertarians or whatever are more afraid to speak? That's a good thing. So I think reaching those people would be pretty difficult.
I think that's probably true. Yeah. Authoritarians are going to be authoritarian. I mean, it's hard. I mean, authoritarianism is a personality trait. It's for people who are authoritarians, whether on the right or the left, it's going to be hard to change their mind because personality traits are just not that plastic. Yeah.
Brandon, is it not accountability because of the disproportionality of the responses that come in? Because there were some moments where Justin and you were saying it's conceivable that some forms of grandstanding might be appropriate. So is it mainly an empirical point to challenge how this can be an accountability practice, or is it a conceptual or substantive point?
Well, I'm going to be a little weaselly here. I guess I want to know more about when people say accountability, what do they mean? Do they mean I'm giving people their due, or I'm contributing to something that gives people their due? I mean, it's weird to think like if you rob a 7-Eleven or something and then like you're put to death, like, well, that's just accountability, you know? I mean, I don't know if that really is accountability. It's something. If you just mean holding people to account for their behavior, then in that trivial sense, I think it's accountability. But I think one thing that matters to a thicker notion of accountability is, what are your motivations? And I think a lot of people's motivations is not to give people their due. It is, well, this is my inner Nietzschean coming out. I think it's to exercise their will to power. And here's a convenient, weakened calf that I can pounce on. But I realize that's probably not a widely shared view. I have to keep the Nietzschean in me from rising up and taking over. I have to like keep the Nietzschean in me sort of like tamped down. I can't let him take over my head, because you spend too much time on Twitter, and Nietzsche's moral psychology starts looking more and more plausible.
Thanks. Sherry, you're up next.
Hey, can you guys hear me okay? Great. All right, thanks for coming, Dr. Warmke. I appreciate this. I had a question that I think some of it has been addressed with your back and forth with Nastasia, but it's similar to the disappointment criteria. So I was a little confused by it. You mentioned that people can be motivated by multiple things. I mean, we're all social creatures, so it's kind of like, there might be some recognition desire going on very, very frequently. And obviously that's not sufficient to cause something to be grandstanding. And then, you know, you say the recognition desire has to reach a certain level of strength for it to be problematic. And I agree with that. But the way you guys flesh that out is through this criterion of if you would counterfactually be disappointed that, you know, you weren't able to change somebody's, or you didn't leave somebody with the moral evaluation you wanted to instill in them, then you're grandstanding. Your recognition desires reach the problematic level. And I guess I feel like disappointment's way too noisy of a variable to do this job. So it's like, I mean, you guys touched on this in your conversation about narcissistic personality disorder, but I'm thinking like there's going to be counterexamples on both sides. Some people are going to be inherently very sensitive to the moral evaluation of other people. And it seems to me that for those such people, they're almost going to automatically be grandstanding when they make a moral expression. And on the other side of it, some people don't care at all what people think about them morally, and yet they might have like a goal for some other reason to make somebody think of them as a good person. Thinking about somebody on like going on a date and saying, oh, you know, I really care a lot about the environment, yada, yada, just trying to impress their date. They want to make them think they're a morally good person. If it doesn't work out for them, if the person doesn't walk away with that belief, they don't really care though. In the same way you guys lay out the example about the person who wants I think it was like a National League baseball team to make the World Series or win the World Series. And they don't, they just sort of shrug and say, oh, well, like, yeah, they had the desire for it, just like this person on the date did, but their personality is such that they just kind of don't care if it doesn't work out. And my issue with this is like, it seems like you're gonna get people caught in the web of grandstanding that probably don't belong. And then you're gonna not get people that clearly do belong if you put in this disappointment criterion. So I'm wondering if you can flesh out, like, maybe I'm not understanding exactly what disappointment means in this context. I just kind of took it like at face value, but it seems to run into these weird issues.
I think everything you said is probably right. Yeah, I think the way that we envision the disappointment test is it's a kind of heuristic. I don't know if we say that, I can't remember, but I think we think of it as a kind of rule of thumb. So is it going to be a perfect heuristic? I don't think so. For all the reasons that you mentioned, and others. I mean, I think it's hard to, you know, well, I mean, here's one reason. Why disappointment? Why is that the thing that matters? You know, we say in the book, it's supposed to sort of track the care that someone has invested into their, you know, sort of social preening, but why is that the appropriate, you know, emotional reaction, and as opposed to anger or sadness or, you know, whatever else? So I think I probably agree with everything you just said. The difficulty is coming up with something. Some people have suggested the counterfactual test of, if it weren't for the recognition desire, would you have still said what you did? I don't think that works, because you could have lots of other really strong motivations that might have led you to say that, even if you subtracted the recognition desire. So I don't think that test works. There's got to be some sort of heuristic that gets at the target, which is a desire of a certain strength. And at that point, I just say, yeah, let's hear some proposals. I mean, I think this is any account of bragging or bullshitting or lying. You know, how strong does the indifference have to be? How strong does the desire to deceive have to be? I think those are all going to be difficult questions. I mean, one solution to this problem is just to not make it a desire at all, just to make it an intention. Do you have an intention? Have you intended to impress other people? I think that's a view that we had. So that would have been, instead of the recognition desire, it's the recognition intention. That was a really early view that we floated in when we were writing the original paper. I think we got rid of it because it wasn't able to capture all the cases in which it looks like someone is not it's a question about how conscious you have to be of your intentions, but how conscious you are of what you're doing. And we wanted a fuller notion. But one response to your challenge is to say, all right, here are the prototypical cases. The paradigmatic cases of grandstanding have the grandstanding statement, the recognition desire, and a recognition intention. And the intention is you either have it or you don't. It's an executive attitude. It's not something that really that comes in degrees. And so you could skirt the problem that way. So one perhaps improvement on our view is just to replace or add the grandstanding desire, replace it with the grandstanding intention. But I think everything you said sounds right to me.
Next up, we've got Connor.
Hi, thanks for being here. This is great. So my question, okay, so I think there are like different ways that we can understand like parent-child relationships. But one way I think of casting parent-child relationships is by saying that that sort of relationship is just like a prolonged period of grandstanding in which the parent is using the sort of language that grandstanders often do to try to get their child to act the right sort of way. And their child responds to specifically the desire to impress their parents or to be like approved of by their parents. And so if it's valuable to do it in this context for the sake of like moral education, why shouldn't we think that it's okay for moral education, generally speaking, for those who have lacked moral education in childhood, perhaps, to use grandstanding to bring them in and to try to teach them something about morality?
Yeah, good. Can you say a little bit more about, in the parent-child relationship, the analog? Who's doing the grandstanding and what's the purpose of it?
I think it's both. So there's a sense in which the parent will dramatize sort of the sorts of wrongs that a child will commit to make a point about, this is the wrong thing to do, you should correct your behavior here. And then additionally, like the child, I mean, if you've been around like a 3-year-old and you see like another child like steal a toy, and then this other 3-year-old takes the toy and gives it back to the original child, and then that child will run to their parent and be like, look what I did, mommy, like I saved this child, for like approval. So it seems like on both sides, there's grandstanding done by the parent to get the child to act correctly, and grandstanding done by the child to get the approval of the parent. And so that process is what creates a child who is morally competent after a certain period of time. And I guess the concern would be that there are some people who just missed out on good moral education when they were younger, and grandstanders can grandstand to kind of educate them morally.
Yeah, good. So a couple thoughts come to mind. One is, our argument against grandstanding assumes that we're talking about a certain kind of context, which is the context of like public discourse. I know that's not real clearly demarcated, but I think that a context of, say, parental moral education is not a context of what we have in mind, which is like more or less morally mature adults reasoning together about morality. So there might be, a lot of our arguments against grandstanding are arguments about how it affects this practice of public discourse, of moral talk. So one response might be just to say, well, that's a different context. Just like it's wrong to lie to your partner about where were you last night. It's not wrong to lie in a game where the goal is to lie, right? Or part of the game is to lie or to deceive. So it might be that there are some things that are wrong to do in public discourse, that are okay to do, at home with your kids, right? When you're teaching them not to steal or something. So that might be one kind of reply, is that the morality of these practices depends on certain kinds of contextual features. The other response is, it's possible. I mean, I guess I sort of, I'm not reporting anything but a shiver. My spine shivers a little bit when I hear people talking on public discourse on Twitter or whatever about educating. I don't know if I need to be educated. I mean, sure, you can give me an article to read, give me an argument, give me a moral consideration I haven't thought of. That's one thing. Showing me how good you are or good you think you are, I'm not sure how that's educating me. What am I learning? I'm learning that you think you're a good person. Okay, well, welcome to the club. So I don't have anything to report except that it feels a little paternalistic I have this view, it's probably a childish view, that, when we meet each other in public discourse, we should treat each other more or less as sort of like moral equals. And that we should reason together about these moral issues, like we're sort of on the same sort of playing surface. You shouldn't presume that other people are evil just because they have a different view. You shouldn't presume that people are morally backwards just because they disagree with you or they live a different way. And so I think I have to think more about what the argument would be, but I'm just reporting a kind of bristling at the kind of moral discourse, public discourse as educational tool. I don't want people to treat me that way, here, let me educate you, Warmke, about, that's like, okay, well, how about you just talk to me? Yeah, but at the moment, I don't have, Connor, I don't really have anything to offer by way of an argument. I have to think more about it.
So, and for what it's worth, I'm inclined to agree with most of what you say. This is just me playing devil's advocate.
Yeah.
But so, sorry, there's air conditioning stuff going on in the background just as I'm speaking, which is perfect. So, okay. So with the contextual, the argument that you're using when it comes to context, it seems like I agree with you that parent-child relationship is a particular sort of context in which you can get away with doing sorts of things that wouldn't be appropriate in other contexts. However, I think the picture gets a little complicated when you get to certain sorts of communities. So in marginalized groups like the LGBT community, for instance, people in that community really take seriously educating others about the important historical moments in LGBT history. And so it seems like within these sorts of communities, grandstanding might be less problematic because there's this group of people who largely might be considered to have certain sorts of shared goals. And because of that, grandstanding might be permissible insofar as there is some sort of analogy between the parent and the child and the person within the LGBT community who's a veteran, so to speak, and then the younger LGBT people that don't know as much about the sorts of things that gay and trans people have gone through to get to where they are. Yeah. And in those cases, it at least strikes me that grandstanding could be more permissible than it would be in other cases.
That could be. I would just say briefly, I'd want to hear more about, the way that we think about grandstanding, especially in the empirical work. It's about status seeking. And I want to hear, I would want to hear more, if this argument were to be fleshed out, I'd want to hear more what the relationship is between educating other people for their benefit and my status seeking. How are those things supposed to, how am I educating by seeking status? I guess that would be, I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm just saying I'd want to know, first of all, how that's supposed to work. What's the story there? And then is it possible to help others? And we talk about these altruistic motivations. So educate educate has this like connotation of just like paternalistic, like, let me educate you. Well, how about like, let me help you. Like, let me help you understand, let me share my experiences with you, and I think that can be an altruistic motivation. I don't think that requires, or we would even be well served by egoistic or status seeking motivations. But I haven't thought a lot about it. So that's just my first swipe. By the way, thanks for all your likes on Twitter. I appreciate that.
Thanks for that. All right, next up, we've got, in order, Karang, and then Lynn and Jake.
Thanks. I have a question about vanity. I'm wondering if you see vanity and honor as different, and if so, how do you see them as different? And how do you think of the idea of cultivating a society where people value honor rather than vanity in order to stop or reduce grandstanding?
It's a fine question. I don't know much about honor. Or the philosophical discussions of honor. I know Tamler Summers has this book on honor. Have you read it? Are you familiar with the? No. Do you have a sense of what honor is, or you could help me?
Have a rough idea of the difference between vanity and honor. I think people who value vanity don't really care about what their real character of traits, but people who value honor care about their character of traits and trying to cultivate a real virtuous state, rather than just let other people think I have this character traits. I also want myself to really have those kind of traits.
Yeah, that seems right. I mean, we have the term honorable, which means someone who's worthy of honor, or someone for whom it's fitting to honor. And I don't think there's nothing like that with vanity. I mean, you're vain. You're either vain or you're not. There's nothing like. So let's see. What am I trying to say? Yeah, I think it might be possible if this is probably not. It'd be hard to make this argument to a lot of academics to try to promote the notion of honor. I think honor and honor culture is often seen as a kind of backwards, illiberal or something virtue. But it seems to me that if you're right, that honor and seeking honor is primarily concerned with becoming an honorable person. Whether or not people see you as honorable, then that, as far as I can tell, would be a better social norm than people seeking status. I don't know if I really have much more to say. That seems something that I'm amenable to.
Thank you, Karang. Lynn, you're up next.
Thank you for talking with us, and I enjoy your book. I have a couple of thoughts. Well, the first thought, it's actually not a question, it's a comment. And it's a comment about the first problem we were discussing about detectability, because I remember like last seminar, I had a comment on this issue that, well, I try to propose a clue for, it's a clue instead of justification for regarding somebody as grandstander. And this clue is inconsistency. So if a person make obviously contradictory moral statement according to like different audience, then this might be a clue for thinking that the person is grandstanding. And of course, like people's opinion might change, people's judgment might change. But I think if a person just keep switching between two stands, like for example, if I speak with my friend who is a supporter for abortion, then I just argue that abortion is morally right. And then I speak with another professor who is against abortion, then I just say abortion is wrong. And I keep doing this, then this kind of inconsistency seems to be at least sort of indicator or a clue for grandstanding. And I think this is also the sort of criteria we use when we are like try to recognize liar in practice, because normally we are like we're more likely to regard a person as liar if we notice like what the person said is contradictory with what maybe his own action or something else he said. So I think those kind of practical, I cannot say it's a, like really justification or criteria or definition or anything else, but I think it can be, it is practical and it can be beneficial to the social interaction we have. Well, and another question is actually inspired by the question of Connor and Carol about the issue of moral education or cultivation. Well, when Connor talks about the parenthood like relationship, what struck me as an analogy is that, well, because I think when a child is very young, he doesn't have the idea, the concept of norm, and initially, all the like normative statement that the child make is likely to just be the sort of action in order to get the recognition from the parents. And so this is the initial state of like normative education. And then gradually the child started to have the concept of norm or morality. Well, but I'm hesitant to think that this kind of process can happen in the public discourse where participants are expected to be mature adults. But I don't know, it's just a question that it suddenly occurred to me.
Good. Yeah, I think on the second point, I think yeah, I think there are a lot of differences with these two different moral contexts and what kind of communities are in play. I do think the parent-child relationship calls for, in many ways, a very different set of moral and social norms. I think this is almost like a truism. Like, of course, the parent-child relationship has governed by different norms and expectations than the moral community at large. To your first point about social cues, I absolutely agree that there probably are highly reliable social indicators of grandstanders. I think this is almost certainly true. I do think it's harder to know, like in a one-off case, whether someone is grandstanding. But I agree that if you observe people's behavior for long enough, you can raise your credence justifiably that this person's a grandstander. And I think inconsistency is a great example. I think hyperbole is a great example, because hyperbole is often a way to get attention. And I think there are always like little verbal tics or cues that people use when they're trying to draw attention to themselves. I think inconsistency is a real nice one. And look, I don't call grandstanders out. I don't think I've ever publicly accused someone of grandstanding, but you better believe I believe that there are grandstanders. I could give you a list of 20 philosophers who I think are like grade A, like really expert grandstanders. And here's a kind of evidence for that. So Justin and I are writing a piece for the Chronicle of Higher Ed about how a lot of academics will take these moral and social stands that are costless, that push the burdens onto others. Okay. So a lot of diversity requirements are like this. It's like you rarely find a white male arguing for diversity in hiring and then resigning, right? It's like, you could just resign. Like, why not? Like, well, that's kind of costly. I can do more good if, well, no, the most good you could do is like resign. But no one does that. No white man has ever resigned for diversity reasons, as far as I can tell. So what they want is they want to push these burdens onto others, right? Other white men need to feel the burdens of our promotion of diversity. Okay, here's an example of this. Last year, right around this time of the year, universities started non-renewing adjunct contracts, for example, and lecturer contracts. And there was a petition that went around among academics where these philosophers, many of whom were philosophers, but academics more generally, signed this petition, this statement saying they would not accept speaking engagements at universities that non-renewed any faculty member because of COVID. Okay, well, it's like, wow, all right, well, you got some skin in the game. Well, maybe do you have skin? Like, how many talks are there going to be? Like, maybe these talks are going to be canceled anyway. But here's the pièce de résistance. I just glanced through this list, okay, and found the philosophers. And one of the philosophers who signed that petition gave a talk at my university last fall. And I think, and in my university, non-renewed about 15 lecturers, fired all adjuncts, and also let go about 100 classified staff. So it's not like, and you could easily Google this, right? You could just go look and see, did Bowling Green let anyone go because of COVID? So like, did they forget? Did they forget they signed the petition? Well, that suggests they didn't take it that seriously. Or, maybe they thought, well, I'll sign this petition, I'll feel good about it, my name will be on there, but like people will forget about it by the time it comes, in the fall to accept these speaking engagements. And I think, that it's defeasible evidence, but I think it's some evidence for behavior that suggests someone is trying to take a stand simply because it looks good, and unconcerned with actually, doing anything that would cost them anything. So these sort of costless stands, I think, are often great examples of grandstanding. Do you have skin in the game, or are you just doing this to look good? And I think oftentimes what you'll find is people have little, if any, skin in the game.
Yeah, great. Actually, this is related to my last question. I'm sorry, I have too many questions. The last question is about what do you think is the difference in terms of the moral nature of grandstanding and other actions that people do in order just to get moral recognition? I have this question because the action that I'm thinking about is like rich people. Some rich guy, they make donation, very large amount of donation, just in order to let the public think highly of him. And even though I feel like this is, of course, it's less principle compared with somebody who donate out of like sincere intention, but I still it is good for this rich person to make donation because that's really helpful.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
Yeah.
I share your view. I think at least in this case, they're at least doing something good. I mean, ostensibly, let's assume it's a good charity. It's actually going to help people and so on. This is why, at the end of the book, we recommend, if you really want to satisfy your recognition desire, you just got to do it. You just got to satisfy that desire for something. Go do something that's actually going to help people, and then take a selfie and post it on Facebook, right? That is going to be at least more helpful than cheap talk on Twitter, calling people names, engaging in hyperbole, arguing that we should defund the police, like that sort of stuff is not helping anybody. Okay. Do something that's actually going to help someone, and then take a picture of it for status. I mean, at least in that case, there's some compensating benefit. But I think for a lot of grandstanding, it's just cheap talk. It really is it's like just empty calories. There is no benefit whatsoever, except to the person who's grandstanding. And so, yeah, I think those things are less bad. Yeah. If they're bad at all, they're less bad.
And I'm wondering if it's also related to the cost of action. It seems like cost of just criticizing somebody is pretty cheap, but like making donation is higher. So I think I can think of one case of grandstanding that can be morally good. For example, in Nazi Germany, where moral criticism are generally repressed, and there is a person who sincerely, who first, he made a judgment that Hitler is bad, but like he personally is not willing to say it just for the sake of like justice or morality. But then he noticed that if he just said this statement, then he'll be able to like attract attention like from a certain group of people. So he just made the statement, which he believed to be true, but the pure intention of him expressing this judgment is to get more recognition. But in this case, I'm hesitant to say that it's clearly morally bad.
Yeah, our official view is that all grandstanding has some bad features, and much of it is morally wrong. So like lots of things, I think, there are going to be exceptions. There are going to be things that are grandstanding, that are morally permissible. The challenge would be to find a case in which it has no bad features whatsoever. And maybe this is a case, I don't know. Maybe we're just wrong about that.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for that, Lynn. We are out of time, and I know that there are still some people who have some questions. So before we wrap up, I just want to put in a plug for the upcoming events in the Spring 21 Gene Beer Blumenfeld Center for Ethics series. Just next week, for instance, we've got two events, one on Tuesday, April 13th at 11 Eastern Time. Mark Murphy from Georgetown will be joining us to talk about law without coercion. And the next day on Wednesday, April 14th at 12:30 Eastern Time, Clark Wolf from Iowa State will be speaking about human extinction. Full details about these and all other upcoming events are available from the Ethics Center website at ethics.gsu.edu. And please let me take this opportunity to thank Professor Brandon Warmke from Bowling Green State University for joining us today and being part of such a stimulating and constructive conversation. Professor, thank you very much. And to the students, thanks for generating a great conversation. There's still much more to speak about, but our time is up. So thank you all. And I hope you all stay warm and well. And once again, Brandon, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Be well all.
I'm also happy to hang around if anyone still has questions, if anyone wants to. Everyone's disappearing, but I don't know.
Jake, our detection theorist guy, just took off, but Connor and Tom, you're welcome to stick around for a few moments. And thanks for that offer, Brandon. Well, I'm going to turn off the recording.
I should have said that earlier, but